Hello everybody and welcome to the channel. If you've been here before, welcome back. If you're new here, please click on like and subscribe. Now this video, I'll be showing you how to build this walnut step stool. It's a double step stool, 15 inches tall. And the steps are about 7.5 inches apart, 3/4 inch wood, so it makes it about 8.25 inches high per step. Now I don't necessarily build them all this way. I just want to show you this is one of the ways to build them. This is how I learned how to make sure my steps were even, how I didn't have any wobbles or wonky spots in it. And again, I don't always do it this way, but this is an easy way to help keep your cuts even and make sure everything goes together properly. The first thing I want to do is get a plan. So I've got this drawn out on a piece of paper. I use this paper all the time. It's easy to do on graph paper. I've got 1 square per inch, so I can go ahead and draw it out, get an idea of what I need. Now, not everything is done on here. For instance, the width of the supports are different depending on how thick I plane the wood. So if we do a 1 inch thick plain wood, your supports will be a little bit thinner. If you do a 1/2 inch plain wood, your supports will be wider. So I don't cut those until the end, or until I get the end result of the wood. So the first thing I want to do is put it in my saw and cut the end off. So I've got a nice flat edge on the end. Now it's rough cut lumber, so the sides are crooked also. We're going to straighten those out on the table saw here in a minute. Once I get this cut, I'm going to cut about 5 pieces out. I'm going to cut 2 pieces for the sides. They're going to be cut in 2 different sections. One's going to be 15 inches tall. Actually, I'm going to make it 15.5, just so I've got enough room to trim it down if I need to. The next piece is going to be 8 inches, and I need 2 each of those. And I need a 12-inch piece for the top step and a 12-inch piece for the bottom step. So back to my plan, as you can see, I need 15 inches wide. My board isn't 15 inches wide, so I'm going to have to add something to that. So decide what you want to do. I'm going to do 10 and 5 myself and glue them together. I don't need the other piece to be as tall. I only need it to be as tall as the step, which is 8 inches. It's going to be cut down to 7 3/4, 7.5. So what I'm going to do is measure out my 8 inches, but I want to double that. Now, if you already have finished lumber, you may want to just go ahead and cut it where it's at. If you have to run this through a planer, it's easier to run it through the planer by putting both pieces through at the same time. So I'm going to cut it at like 19, and then I'm going to cut it down to the size I need it after running it through the planer. So this last piece of the board here has a big crack in it. As you can see, it runs basically all the way through the board. If I drop this on the floor, it's just going to split in half, but I do have enough to make one of my stairs out of here. So I'm going to cut a 12.5 inch piece out of here, 8 inches wide. Again, I'm going to run this through the planer before I cut it. It'll just be easier to run a longer piece of wood through the planer, make sure I get it flat. Now, as you can see by the boards that I was using, they've got a lot of bow in them. So I'm going to make sure I run these through the planer several times. I'm probably going to end up with 3/4 inch lumber. I kind of like to have 1 inch, 3/4, probably minimum for a step stool. So I'm going to go ahead and grind these down to 3/4 of an inch until I get them planed. So over on the table, I have them laid out. This is going to be my 2 sides. That's my 2 small panels, and my 1 long piece I'm going to cut it in half to basically join it together. So I'm going to cut one of these at 8 inches. This is going to be for my 2 side sections, and the other ones are going to have 12 inches for my stool steps. Now again, depending on your lumber, you may cut these in a different order than I'm cutting them in. Since some of my lumber was finished now, some of it has a rough edge on it. The one piece has a big crack down the middle I'm cutting out. I'm kind of skipping around a little bit, but I basically want to end up with all the pieces of my stool in a pile before I go to put anything together. So the first piece already had a finished edge on it. I'm going to go ahead and cut it off at 8 inches. I've got a 12x8 step ready to go. Now on the other one with the cracked edge, it also has an unfinished edge on the side. Missed in the recording there, but as you can see in the video, I've trimmed off the uneven edge. Now the other side's still a rough edge. It's not perfect, but again, I've got that crack in there, and now I've got my better side as flush as I could get it with the rough edge. I'm going to run this through here at over 8 inches because I don't want it to be thinner than 8 inches because I still want to run my other side back through and straighten it out. So I've got my crack cut out of there now, and I've got the piece of board I want. Now remember, this is longer because it was an unfinished piece. So it's probably 20 inches long right now, and I'll be able to cut that knot hole out of the end of it when I get done. As you can see, when I push it back through the saw, it catches the edge a little bit there, and I can see against my fence that it's not perfectly straight yet. So I'm going to run it through a couple of times super thin just taking the edge off, checking my fence, and make sure that I've got it nice and even. Then you can run the second step back through there again if you need to, and both steps will be the exact same size. So back over at the chop saw here, I've got that step I've cut off to 8 inches wide, and again I need to get the knot hole out where my left thumb is there. I want to make sure I trim off the end, so I've got a nice flush piece on the end here. Then I'm going to slide it over and cut my 12-inch top out of here. Now I'm going to use the other top that I've already got, or my other stool step. I'm going to line them up. If you have anything off at the end there, if you cut them both at the same time, you'll have a nice flush cut. And same on the other side. If you've left it a little bit longer, like I left mine like 12 1/8, I can go ahead and cut both of these at the same time, and both steps will be exactly the same. So that'll be my double steps checked off the list. We're going to start working on the side pieces now. Again, depending on what the width of your wood is, determine what you need to put together to make them together. So you can make it 10, 11 inches in my case. And then we want to make the other side. So the total is 16 inches or 15.5 inches wide. We're going to cut it down to 15 to square it off, but you definitely want an overlap. So if you make any mistakes, you have a room to correct them. So back over to the table saw, I'm going to clean off my edges. As I showed you before, basically skin the edges 2 or 3 times to make sure I've got nice flat surfaces, and cut out any of the wood that may be damaged and get 2 nice clean pieces of wood. Same on my shoulder piece there. I'm going to clean up the edges before I cut the width of them. That way I can cut them at the same time and make sure they're both even. So I'm going to cut the taller side panels first, and then I'm going to cut the 2 smaller panels without moving the saw. That way I have 2 equal panels. Now these are my short steps. I'm going to do the same thing here. I'm going to cut both of them at the same time. Again, depending on what width you needed to make this equal on both sides. Now we're going to go ahead and make the support. Since we know the thickness of our board is 3/4 inches. Our step is 12 inches wide. I want a 1/2 inch hanging off of both sides. So I need to subtract 3/4, 3/4 from 12 inches, and then another 1 inch for half on each side. So that'll leave me 9.5 inches. I want to make the width of my boards 1.5 wide. You can do that 2 inches, 3 inches, whatever you want for whatever style you're doing. So here are my parts laid out. Got my 7 supports, my 2 steps, my 2 side pieces ready to glue together. So I need to get those side pieces go ahead and glued together. If you need to join them, use a joiner. If not, use a sander. If you cut them a couple times like I showed you on the saw, they shouldn't need jointed. They should fit together perfectly fine as long as your saw is set up correctly. I just want to glue these up. I don't want to get a lot of squish out. I want squish out, but I don't want it to the point where I have to clean the panels completely. So make sure you get enough glue on here to actually join them together. So before somebody lets me know, yes, I know that's not the safest way to be doing this, but round over your edges on your boards. 6 of these only get rounded over on one end. One board gets rounded over on both sides. So use a push stick and make sure you use safety precautions. I'm going to go ahead and round over my steps. Now I'm not doing my side panels until they get done dry gluing. Of course it won't take long in the video, but it'll take overnight till the panels are done gluing together. I just want to go around the corner there. I want to make sure I round the edge well. And then I'm going to take some sandpaper when I get done and hit that corner also, just to make sure it's not a sharp edge for anyone to hit a toe or something on. So again, there's my supports. I've got 7 of them. Again, 1 is rounded on both sides. The other ones are only rounded on one side. About 24 hours later, time to pop the clamps off, check our panels, make sure they're glued well. And then we're going to straighten them out a little bit before we cut them down to the size that we need them. So I'm starting from the bottom and the back. So I'm going to do the bottom first because we want 2 nice flat bottoms. Now I know my first step is going to be 7.5 inches. As you can see, I've got 8 inches space there. That gives me enough room to slide this down a sled and get a nice straight edge on the bottom of it. I'm going to do this for both panels and make sure I don't cut down below that 7.5 inches. Now, if your table saw is bigger than mine, you probably don't need a sled to do this. My table saw is pretty small. It's just a job site saw. So I'm using a sled to make sure I keep the board nice and straight as I slide it down there. Again, I'm going to do both panels bottoms. Now I'm going to go ahead and cut them off to 15 inches, which is my overall finished size. Make sure you're flush against your fence. I used a stop here. That way both of them are exactly the same. Again, I slide it in, pull it tight, and cut it off. And then my sides are both equally as high. Now for everybody's favorite part, a little bit of sanding. Now if you had glue sticking up, hopefully you sanded those before you ran them through the sled. I forgot to mention that in there. I didn't have much glue because you saw I wiped it off once I put them together. But if you had glue on there, make sure you sand that before you run them through your sled, or it can throw your sides off a little bit. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to tape these two panels together. Now again, you don't have to do this. You can cut both of them individually if you want to. I just learned that if you do this, you will keep them together, and no matter what your cuts look like, they're going to match on both sides. So if you make a mistake on one side, at least you match the mistake on the other side, and you don't have to try to make them work. I've got this on my tabletop surface, so it's nice and flat on the top of my table saw. And I'm going to just start taping pieces here and there and making sure I keep it flat and flush to the front, the back, the sides, the top at all times. Also be sure when you're taping, you keep the tape flat. Don't start stacking up a bunch of tape, because you'll end up with possible rise or something in there when you go to cut it. So these are all pretty flush. It's not going to affect my cuts. I'm going to go ahead and mark my boards now. I only need to mark the top board since I'm cutting through both at the same time. I'm going to use my dimensions here. Again, if yours are different than mine, mark whatever you need to. I'm going to draw this out on the board so I can cut it out. Now this step, if you do a lot of these, you may figure out what degree you want. I usually use about a 3-degree pitch on here. You can line it up with your pencil mark like I'm doing here, slide it back and forth, or you can just set it to 3 degrees, 5 degrees, whatever you want your slope to be, and chop it off. I do have the screw down on the other side. You can't see it here to keep my board from flipping since it's heavier on that side, but I'm going to go ahead and cut off both the bottom steps at the same time. Then I've got 2 perfectly flush edges on my front. Now you can use a skill saw to do that, a jigsaw, reciprocator saw, whatever you want. It just so happens that these numbers fit in my chop saw pretty well. I'm going to do the same thing here with the top piece. I'm going to pull it down. As you can see, my blade almost touches. Now if you're doing this on a table saw, remember your blade is going to upcut and you're going to cut into your other piece. So make sure you down cut, not upcut. And when I go to cut my flush piece off, since I'm set at 0, my front pitch again was 3 degrees, so I need to set my saw back to 3 degrees. So technically it makes my line 90 degrees again, if that makes any sense. Again, if not, that's where the laser comes in handy, or the guide light on your saw. And then you can just move your table back and forth until your pencil line is straight, and then cut your pencil line out. Again, you can do this with a skill saw, table saw, hand saw, whatever you want. Now the angle's not going to let me cut it perfectly off without digging into the other piece. If it's for yourself, or if you don't mind a little nick in your other piece, you can go ahead and just nip it off. I'm going to go ahead and just stick this on my bandsaw and finish cutting it. Again, you can take a skill saw, you can take a jigsaw. I've got a rough blade bandsaw on here, so mine leaves some bacon strips on here, so I'm just going to go ahead and smooth out my bacon. Again, depending on how you cut it or what you cut it with, you may not have to do this, but I'm sanding both pieces again, still taped together at the same time. And I'm making sure I go back and forth and sand them both evenly. Don't just dig in there and grind your bacon pieces out and leave it. It'll make your stool look bad if you do. So now I'm going to go ahead and round over the edges on my panel. Again, you don't have to do this on the side panels. It's entirely up to you. Depending on what kind of bit you're using, you want to make sure you don't do the spot with the stool step that's going to touch on it. You just want to do the faces that are going to be seen. So you're going to do that back edge, you're going to do the front edge, and you're going to do the front edge of the top step. If you do the sides of the steps where they go, it just doesn't look right. And again, if you're rounding over, if you're using a 45 bit, it may look a little bit different, but basically whatever finish you want on those sides, go ahead and run those through there now. And that's just a little bit of water on the bottom where I got some glue on it earlier. Now when you go to route in this corner, if you run this all the way down in, you're going to end up with like a little curve or a little dent in there. I've learned this over just experience. It really doesn't matter. You can't really see it. You know it's there. The customer probably won't know it's there. You won't know it's there after a while anyhow. But when you do that, make sure you just run that in until it almost touches the corner and not all the way. You can bump it a little further if you have to, but again, it looks better to do it this way. The step itself will cover up the error you put in it either way, but it'll look better from the side. Now, as you've seen, I work in a garage. My garage has got a little bit of space, so I'm using these old work tables. Make sure you use something flat surface. If you got a nice bench top, it won't matter. I grab a piece of 1/2-inch plywood that I've got gridded out. Makes it easier for making alignments for me. So make sure you got a nice flat surface to do this on. If not, your stool's going to sit wonky. I'm going to glue this up. I don't want it to be sloppy, but I want enough glue that it bonds. I'm going to put screws in here anyhow. You can screw it, dowel it, brad it, whatever you want to with it. So I'm going to get enough glue on there that I get a little squish out, but not make a total mess. And once I put this in here, I've got my lines in the back there to let me know that I've got a nice straight line here. You can measure to see how far in you are if you want to, but I've done enough of these, I've just kind of eyeball it to where I like it at. I'm going to take a clamp the bottom piece in place, and we're going to glue this up first like we weren't going to brad it or anything. We're just going to glue it up, let the glue set. As you can see, my squish out there is not a lot, but it's definitely there. I can take a square edge and go across the back of it, make sure I'm square. And I want to make sure that everything is touching the bottom. That way I don't have any wobbles in the stool. Take your time, clean up your glue now. It's easier to clean up glue now than it is to clean it up later, especially on a dark wood. It will stand out like a sore thumb. Now I'm putting the back together first, and then I'm going to work my way to the front. I do have pieces in the front there, as you can see, just to keep it from pulling apart or spreading too far. If I start to get too far apart, I can put a clamp across the front if I need to. I need a little bit of space in front to get the pieces in without having to hammer them in place. Now this is my middle support, so I measured halfway up. As you can see, it should be right about where your line is anyhow for your 7.5 inches. But if you don't have that long line going across there, you can mark it there. And I'll put this in the middle. Now this is the one that is rounded on both sides. And the reason for that is you can see it from both sides. As the other one sits on the bottom, the step sits on the tops of the other one, so you don't really need those rounded. Again, spread it out, set it in place, clamp it, wipe off all your glue. And we're just going to repeat this process until we get all the supports in place. Again, glue, double check, make sure you're flush. You don't want this sticking up. If you have it sticking up in it, you're going to have to sand it down or your step's going to sit crooked. So make sure you take your time on this part and get it straight and clean it up. Now again, as I finish each of these, I'm checking them with the right angle there, making sure they're flush on the top. If they need to be adjusted, adjust them now. Again, easier to adjust them now than adjust them later. So each one I do, I check it. That one needed tapped in place. Again, clean up the glue. Now for the steps, again, I don't really have any measurements for these. You can add measurements if you want to. I just put them where they look good to me. You want to make sure they're far enough back that you don't stub a toe on them in the front, and far enough towards the back that they'll support the step well in the back. But you don't want them overhanging where you can see them. And this is usually the hardest piece to get in, which is the last one. Take a square, line it up, make sure it's even. Again, keep tapping down on those bottom ones and make sure you're flush. So after the glue sets up, I'm going to let this set up for about 5 hours. The glue is actually hard enough that the pieces won't come apart now, but I'm going to leave the clamps on anyhow. I'm just going to move the clamps over where I can recess some holes in them and drill them. So basically what I'm going to do is I'm going to put a single clamp in the middle, remove the clamps, move them around, and give me access to where I can drill my holes. I'm going to use a 10mm countersink. That way I can put plugs in it, make it look like dowels. Just gives it a more finished look. You can run dowels in here if you'd rather dowel it. Now I did use a pilot bit to help keep these from splitting. If you're not careful, you can still split these with screws. So basically I'm going to run the screw in and out a few times. As I'm going in, I'm not going all the way in with the screw. I'm going down a little bit, back it up, down a little bit, back it up, down a little bit, back it up. That'll help keep you from stripping it out. You could put a little bit of oil on it if you were going to oil the board or oil the sides. It's just easier to run them in and run them out a little bit. That'll help keep you from splitting the wood. And you want to repeat that until you've got all of your pieces screwed together. If you see some smoke flying from the bit, yeah, I need a new bit. I've got a small CNC machine, so I make my own plugs for this. So these are 10mm walnut plugs. You can buy 10mm dowel, or again, you can do a 3/8, whatever you've got that you want to dowel with. Basically put a little bit of glue on each one of them and plug all the holes up. Take a little small rubber mallet, make sure you tamp them in all the way. That way they don't fall out later on. So to put the steps on, I'm going to basically do the same thing. I'm going to glue them into place. I'm going to clamp them down, and then I'm going to put 4 screws in each step. You can use 6 screws, 4 screws, 4 dowels, whatever you want, whatever you feel comfortable with. 4 screws is more than enough to hold this in place. I'm 210 pounds, and I've carried at least 50 pounds up these before. These will hold at least 300 pounds when you're done with them. Again, glue, not over glued. You don't want squishing all over the place and running down. And if you make a mess, clean it up now instead of waiting until later. And I was saying earlier, that crappy bit that I was using broke off in the hole. So luckily, I popped the stool back off because the glue wasn't dry yet. I'm going to re-glue it. I'm going to re-screw it back down. I was lucky and got the piece out of there. If not, I would have had to make a stool top, or I would have had to find a way to fix it. So basically, I'm re-gluing the top back on now. I'm going to line it back up the way I had it before. I've got a 1/2 inch overhang on both sides. Check my overhang, and then continue on. Now I am measuring these to make sure I get them in the right spot. I do like the tops to be a little bit more precise just because you can see them. So I'm doing 2.5 inches from the front, 2.5 inches from the back. And then I measured over again. I'm doing 3/4 of an inch with a 1/2 inch overhang. So I'm going in about 3/4 of an inch with my screw holes. That way they're lined up nice and neat. Check the bottom, make sure you wipe off your glue. As I've said 1,000 times, I know people are going to be breaking them for that. But again, clean all this up now instead of waiting until it dries later. If you have to, use a little screwdriver, a little set screw, something like that. Get back up in there and get all that glue out of there. I'm going to set the top the same way. Basically pick whatever you want to overhang the back. Again, I kind of like 1/2 inch myself. If you want to hang over more, hang over less, set it to where you want it. Clamp it in place. Once you get it clamped in place, go ahead and put your screw holes in it and screw it down. Back to the plugs again. We're going to put a little bit of glue in our hand, or however you want to do this. You can drip it on there. You can put the glue in the hole if you want to. I find it easier to just put a little bit of glue in the palm of my hand, dip it in there, put it in place, and then tap them in. If you don't have one of these, I would recommend getting one. It's a Marples or an Irwin saw. These are small, flimsy little saws, but they will cut you, your finger, and the hardwood super easy. Basically take this, it'll keep you a nice flush cut it off to the bottom, and cut all these little extra pieces off. And then we're going to get the sander out and start sanding. Now when you're sanding these, same as when you're doing the glue around the edges, if you miss any spots on here, you're going to be able to tell as soon as you put oil on it. So make sure you sand those down as best as possible. When you put the oil on it, if you see the glue mark back on it, up to you, depending on how bad it is. Me personally, I usually go back in with a sander and sand it back down to where it's better, and then refinish it again. Now since it's walnut, I'm using a 120 here just to knock down the big stuff. I'm going to go back over it again with a 220. And finish sanding everything out till it's nice and smooth. Next, choose the finish you want. You can poly this, you can shellac it, you can wax and feed it like I'm doing. You can use board wax on it. Choose your preference and go ahead and finish it. And as you're finishing it, Again, keep looking for those little glue spots that'll pop up every now and then. Decide whether they're important, sand them back out if they're in place where you can see it. Since I use the waxing feed, I usually let it sit there for about 15 or 20 minutes and then take a dry microfiber towel and just buff it out a little bit. Make sure there's no extra greasy spots, slimy spots anywhere, and it'll smooth all out. And then sometimes, depending on the product and depending on where it's going, I might take a board butter and butter like you would a cutting board, give it a little smoother shine. Again, depending on whether it's going to be a showpiece or whether people are actually going to use this or not. There's your final result. Thanks for watching. Please click on like and subscribe.